Hey guys, tonight we're spending some time with 5 people who walked into the American wilderness and never walked back out. They came from different decades and different parts of the country. One was a young artist chasing beauty through the red canyons of southern Utah. One was a 6-year-old boy on his first overnight camping trip with his father and grandfather. 2 were teenage girls, one on a school field trip, one taking photographs of a mountain lake with her dad waiting back at camp. And one was a grandmother, a retired nurse, who had walked more than 900 miles of a famous trail and stepped off it for a moment of privacy. 4 of them were never found, and even the one who was found was not found in time. Before we settle in for this one, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find value in what we do here. No pressure and no guilt. And thank you, truly, for all the case suggestions. We read them. We're now on Spotify as well, so the link is in the description if you would rather listen there, in the dark, with your eyes closed. Now dim the lights. Get comfortable. This is a long one, and these 5 people deserve to be heard carefully, one at a time, without any rush. Because behind every one of these cases is something very ordinary. A boy who wanted to surprise his dad, a girl who wanted a good photograph, a woman who simply needed to step off the path. The wilderness did not care that the moment was ordinary. It rarely does. And to understand these stories, we have to sit with a few uncomfortable questions. How does a person vanish so completely that hundreds of searchers, dogs, and helicopters find nothing at all? What does it do to a family to wait years, sometimes decades, for an answer that never comes? And why do these particular quiet corners of the map keep swallowing people whole? Let's start where the oldest of these stories begins, in the desert, in the autumn of 1934, with a young man who loved the wilderness more than almost anything else in his life. Everett Roos was 20 years old, and he had already decided that the ordinary world was not for him. He was born in March of 1914, the younger of 2 sons. His father was a Unitarian minister, a thoughtful man whose work moved the family from town to town every few years, so that Everett grew up without a single fixed place to call home. Maybe that was part of it. Maybe a boy who never quite belonged to one town grew into a young man who belonged only to the open country. By the time the family settled in Los Angeles, Everett was already something unusual. He carved woodblock prints. He wrote poetry, page after page of it, in journals he kept from the time he was a child. He sketched, he painted watercolors, and he read constantly. The kind of boy who at 12 was writing essays and verse while other children were playing in the yard. You have to understand who he was before you can understand why he walked into that canyon, because the wilderness was not an accident for Everett Roos. It was the whole point. Picture him as a teenager, hitchhiking up the California coast, sleeping on beaches, showing up uninvited at the doors of famous artists. He met the photographer Dorothea Lange, who took his portrait. He traded a print with Ansel Adams. He crossed paths with the painter Maynard Dixon. These were some of the most celebrated artists in America, and here was this intense, romantic, slightly awkward young man knocking on their doors, wanting to talk about beauty and light and the desert. They remembered him. People who met Everett Roos tended to remember him, but the cities drained him. He said so himself, in letters home. The streetcars, the crowds, the paved roads, all of it left him feeling flat and uninspired. What lit him up was the country beyond the last town, The high Sierra, the coast, and most of all the deserts of the American Southwest. He gave himself over to it completely. He would disappear for weeks at a time into canyon country with a couple of burros carrying his supplies, and he would paint and write and simply exist inside landscapes so vast and so empty that most people would find them frightening. Everett found them holy. Have you ever wondered what it takes to love solitude that much? To prefer, as he once wrote to his brother Waldo, the saddle to the streetcar and the star-sprinkled sky to a roof. Most of us feel that pull for an afternoon, a weekend at most, and then we want our beds and our walls and the sound of other people. Everett wanted the opposite. In his last letter, written in early November of 1934, he told Waldo that he did not expect to visit civilization again any time soon. He said he had not tired of the wilderness. He said that he enjoyed its beauty and the vagrant life he led more keenly all the time. He preferred the obscure and difficult trail leading into the unknown to any paved highway. Those words would haunt his family for the rest of their lives, because that difficult trail leading into the unknown is exactly where he went. Let's talk about that final autumn. In November of 1934, Everett came through the small town of Escalante in southern Utah to stock up on supplies. He was a familiar enough type out there. The locals were used to sheep herders and cattlemen and the occasional wanderer passing through. Everett spent time in town, talked with people, and then rode out toward the southeast, toward the maze of canyons that fed down into the Escalante River, and beyond that, the Colorado. Before he left, some of the townspeople warned him about the coming winter. Southern Utah is beautiful, but it is not gentle, and the cold can arrive fast and hard in those canyons. Everett was not worried. He told people he planned to be home for Christmas. He wrote 2 last letters before he vanished into the backcountry. One to his parents, Stella and Christopher, and one to Waldo. To his parents, he said he would be out of reach for a couple of months. It was the letter to his brother that carried that darker music, the one about never returning to civilization. The last people known to have seen him alive were 2 sheep herders, camped near Soda Gulch. Everett stayed with them for a few days, and then he told them he was heading down toward Davis Gulch, a narrow, twisting canyon, a couple of miles to the south. He rode off with his 2 burros, his painting supplies, his journals, and his camp gear, and that is where the trail of Everett Roos ends. Now picture Davis Gulch itself, because the place matters. It is not a friendly landscape. It is a deep, sinuous defile carved into red sandstone, walls rising sheer on either side, the floor a tangle of brush and pooled water and hidden drops. The author, John Krakauer, who wrote about Everett, described it as an obscure ravine, twisting for most of its length as a deep, narrow slot in the rock. To get down into it with 2 loaded burros was not a simple thing. It took skill and nerve, and Everett had both. He got himself and his animals to the bottom, made a camp, and settled in. Nobody worried about him for a long time. That was the terrible thing. His parents were so accustomed to his long silences, his months out of contact, that the calendar simply turned. Christmas came and went. Everett did not come home. Still they waited, telling themselves he had lost track of the days, that he was holed up in some cave sketching, that any week now a letter would arrive. It was not until February of 1935, 3 full months after his last correspondence, that they finally wrote to the post office in Escalante and asked whether anyone had seen their son. That letter set the search in motion. A local man named Jennings Allen, whose wife was the town postmistress, gathered a dozen men on horseback and rode down the hole in the rock road toward the canyons. They asked the sheepherders. They followed Everett's trail toward Davis Gulch, and down in the bottom of that canyon, they found the first clues. They found his 2 burros, alive, grazing peacefully, penned in a brush corral that Everett had built himself. The animals were healthy. Someone had been caring for them, or at least had left them somewhere safe. Nearby, the searchers found the remains of his camp. And here is the detail that has kept people awake for 90 years. They found almost none of his belongings. His journals were gone. His paints, his camera, his camp gear, all of it, gone. It was as if Everett had packed up the most important things and walked away on foot, deeper into the canyon, leaving the burros behind with the expectation of coming back. To be fair, there is a quieter explanation for the burros. When the searchers themselves tried to lead the animals out of Davis Gulch, the burros locked their legs on the smooth sandstone and refused to climb. In the end, the men had to rope them and drag them up the rock on their sides, which means Everett may have faced the very same problem. He may have left his burros behind not out of some grand plan, but simply because he could not get them up the canyon wall and he intended to return for them. A practical answer, an ordinary answer, but it does not explain where he went or why he never came back. And then there was the word, carved into the soft stone near an ancient cliff dwelling in Davis Gulch. The searchers found an inscription. It read, Nemo, and beneath it, a year, 1934. In some accounts, the carving read Nemo, November 1934. It was found more than once, in more than one spot, cut carefully into the rock. Nemo, it is Latin for nobody. It is also the name Odysseus gave himself to escape the Cyclops in Homer's ancient story, the trick of calling himself no one. And it is the name of the mysterious self-exiled sea captain in one of Everett's favorite books, Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, a man who turned his back on the world of people and vanished into a realm of his own. Everett had used the name Nemo before. It seems to have meant something to him. This idea of becoming nobody, of dissolving into the landscape until the self simply disappeared. What was he telling us? Was it a signature, the private joke of a young man who loved books? Was it a statement of intent, a declaration that Everett Roos was choosing to become no one at all? Or does it mean nothing beyond what it says? The mark of a 20-year-old alone in a canyon, carving a name he liked into a wall the way people have carved names into walls forever. We don't know. That is the honest answer, and it has not changed in 90 years. The search for Everett went on for months. Jennings Allen's group gave up in March, writing to the family that they had searched the country well on their side of the Colorado River and found no fresh sign of him. But others kept looking. A second search party found another of his camps in a cave, along with more of his boot prints, size 9, and another Nemo carving. Federal agents joined the effort that spring. Men from the Park Service and the Erosion Service and the Indian Service, directed by the superintendent of Mesa Verde. A larger civic group mounted a third search on horseback in May, riding deeper into the canyons than anyone had dared. There were aerial surveys, planes flying grid patterns at 12,000 feet, scanning the ground from Lee's Ferry all the way to Escalante. They found his camps, they found his footprints, they found his art carved into the rock. they never found Everett. His mother, Stella, could not let go. She came to Utah again and again over the years, even making the difficult journey down into Davis Gulch herself, to stand in the place where her son's trail went cold. She kept the search alive in whatever way she could until she died in 1964. 30 years of waiting, 30 years of a mother refusing to close the door on a missing child. Everett's brother Waldo carried the mystery for even longer, into his old age, still turning it over, still wanting an answer. So what happened to Everett Roos? Here is where we have to be careful and separate what is known from what is only imagined. There are several theories, and each has its believers. The first is the simplest and the most likely. He fell, or he drowned. Canyon country is lethal in ways that are easy to underestimate. A single misstep on a smooth sandstone ledge, a flash flood roaring down a slot canyon with no warning, a slip while climbing the ancient hand and foot holds cut into the cliff walls. Any of these could kill a young man instantly and hide his body forever. Those canyons have swallowed experienced people before. Everett was skilled, but he was alone. And alone is where the desert does its quiet work. If he fell into a crack in the rock or was swept into the Colorado, his body could have been carried miles or wedged somewhere it would never be seen. This is what many who know that country believe. The second theory is darker: murder. Waldo himself came to believe his brother met a violent end. There were, by local accounts, 2 cattle rustlers camped up on the Kaiparowitz Plateau above Davis Gulch that winter, men who did not want to be found. The theory goes that Everett, curious, exploring the ruins and climbing the Moki steps up the canyon wall, stumbled onto them, and that the rustlers, mistaking him for the law, killed him before he could explain who he was. Years later, Waldo said he interviewed one of these men on his sickbed, and that before Waldo could even say why he had come, the old man said, "I wasn't the one who killed your brother. Make of that what you will." It is a haunting thing to say, but it is a story told secondhand decades later, and it proves nothing. The third theory is the gentlest, and in a strange way, the one his admirers seem to prefer. That Everett did exactly what Nemo suggested, that he chose to disappear, that he crossed the Colorado, perhaps on the winter ice, and walked into the vastness of the Navajo country, and simply stopped being Everett Roos, living out his days anonymously, a nobody by his own design. There is no real evidence for this, but there is something about the young man's own words, his hunger to dissolve into the wilderness, that makes people want to believe he got what he wanted. And there was, for a brief time, in 2009, the hope of an actual answer. Skeletal remains were found on Comb Ridge, near the town of Bluff, tied to an old Navajo account of a young white man murdered by raiders who wanted his burrows. Early DNA testing and forensic comparison seemed to match Everett. The family allowed themselves to grieve, to believe the wandering was finally over. And then the tables turned. A second, more rigorous round of DNA analysis showed the remains were not Everett at all. They belonged to a Native American man named Joe Santisteven, whose family was finally able to bring him home. It was later determined that a flaw in the DNA matching software had caused the error. Everett's family had buried and unburied their hope in the space of a few months. So the mystery stands, right where it has stood since 1934. Davis Gulch itself is mostly gone now, drowned beneath the waters of Lake Powell after the Glen Canyon Dam went up in the 1960s. The corral where his burros grazed, the caves where he camped, the walls where he carved his strange chosen name. Much of it lies underwater, out of reach. Whatever the canyon knew about Everett Roos, it is keeping. Which is to say, we are left with the same thing his family was left with. A young man of 20 who loved beauty so fiercely that he gave his whole short life to it. A trail of camps and footprints and watercolors, and a word cut into red stone in a canyon now underwater that may have been a signature or a farewell, or simply a name a lonely boy liked to write. Nobody. 1934. He wanted the wilderness more than he wanted the world of people. In the end, the wilderness took him at his word. And if the desert can make a skilled and willing wanderer vanish so completely, then perhaps it should not surprise us how easily it took someone who never meant to be out there at all. A little boy, 35 years later, in the Green Mountains on the other side of the country, who walked a few steps into the trees to surprise his father. Let's talk about Dennis Martin. To tell his story, you first have to understand a family tradition, because that is really where it begins. The Martins were from Knoxville, Tennessee, and for generations the men of that family had a ritual. Every year, over Father's Day weekend, they would drive up into the Great Smoky Mountains and go camping and hiking together. Fathers and sons and grandfathers walking the same trails their own fathers had walked. It was the kind of gentle, unremarkable tradition that holds a family together across the decades. And in June of 1969, it was finally Dennis's turn. Dennis Lloyd Martin was 6 years old, just 6 days short of his 7th birthday. He was a small, quiet boy from Knoxville, described in the records as bright, a little precocious. This was his first overnight camping trip, his first time being included in the grown-up ritual, and by every account, he was thrilled. He set out that weekend with his father, William, whom everyone called Bill, his 9-year-old brother Douglas, and his grandfather, Clyde. 3 generations of Martin men, and the youngest of them getting to come along at last. Picture the 2 boys, Dennis in a bright red shirt and green shorts, keeping pace with the grown-ups on the trail. They started at Cades Cove, one of the most beloved corners of the entire park, a broad green valley ringed by mountains. From there, the family set out on a hike of roughly 13 miles along the loop that connects Russell Field and Spence Field, high meadows up along the crest of the Smokies. The first day went smoothly. Little Dennis kept up. They spent the night out, and the next morning, Saturday, the 14th of June, they made their way up to Spence Field. Spence Field is a highland meadow, a grassy bald running along the very spine of the mountains, right where the Appalachian Trail crosses the ridge. The state line between Tennessee and North Carolina runs straight through it. On a clear June day, it is a beautiful, open place, full of mountain laurel, the kind of view that makes the climb worth it. When the Martins reached it, they met up with another family they knew, and the children naturally fell in together. Dennis and his brother Douglas and 2 other boys from the second family wandered off a little way to play while the adults rested and took in the scenery. And then the boys came up with a plan, a small, ordinary, mischievous plan, the kind children have invented forever. They would hide and then jump out and surprise the grown-ups. To make it better, they decided that Dennis, the littlest one, would split off from the others and circle around so that he could pop out from a different direction. His father watched him go. There was nothing alarming about it. The woods at the edge of the meadow were right there. Dennis, in his red shirt, melted into the tree line, and Bill Martin turned back to the adults and waited for the laughter. The other three boys jumped out first, shouting, giggling. The grown-ups played along, acted surprised, but Dennis did not jump out. At first, of course, nobody panicked. Children wonder. He had only gone a short distance into the trees. Any minute now, he would come running back, grinning, annoyed that his brothers had ruined the surprise. Bill called for him. The others called for him. The minutes stretched out, and the calling grew a little sharper, and Dennis Martin did not answer, and did not appear. Have you ever felt that first cold drop in your stomach? The moment an ordinary situation quietly tips over into something else. That is the moment Bill Martin lived through at Spence Field. One instant, he was a father waiting for a prank. The next, he was a father whose small son had vanished into thousands of square miles of mountain wilderness, and the light was going to start failing in a few hours. The family searched the immediate area themselves frantically in those first minutes and hours. They found nothing at all, no flash of a red shirt, no footprints they could follow, no small voice answering back when they called. As the afternoon wore on toward evening, Bill's father, Clyde, made a decision. He hiked out 6 miles down Anthony Creek Trail to Cades Cove to reach the nearest ranger station and raise the alarm. He got there around 8:30 in the evening, and that is when the machinery of one of the largest searches in American history slowly began to grind into motion. But here is the detail that shaped everything that followed. That night, the weather turned. A storm rolled in over the Smokies, and in a matter of hours it dropped close to 3 inches of rain across the high country. The stream swelled and turned turbulent, the trails washed out, and any scent trail that 6-year-old Dennis might have left, any track his small shoes might have pressed into the earth, was scrubbed away by the deluge before search dogs could ever follow it. The next morning, the 15th of June, the search began in earnest. It started small, a crew of about 30. By early afternoon, it had swelled to 240 people, and it kept growing. Word spread through Knoxville and across the region, on the radio and in the papers, and volunteers began pouring into the mountains. Over the following days, the search for one small boy grew into something the National Park Service would later call, without exaggeration, the most extensive of its kind in the history of the entire park system. At its peak, roughly 1,400 people were involved. There were park rangers and local law enforcement, firefighters and rescue squads from Tennessee, Kentucky, the Carolinas, and Georgia, along with Boy Scout troops and college students, and famously, a group of Green Berets, elite soldiers, was brought in to help comb the terrain. Helicopters flew overhead, including 2 military Huey helicopters dispatched from an air base in Georgia. Base camps were established up on the high ridges. Teams moved out across 50 to 60 square miles of some of the most rugged, tangled, vertical country in the eastern United States. Terrain where the undergrowth is so thick and the ridges so steep that a person can move only a few dozen yards in an hour. And here is where the enormity of the effort became its own kind of enemy. To be fair to everyone who came, they came out of love and decency. Ordinary people who dropped what they were doing to look for a stranger's child. But in 1969, there was no established, coordinated search and rescue plan for the park. Nothing on this scale had ever been attempted there. And so 1,400 untrained and half-trained people moving through delicate wilderness, may actually have destroyed the very evidence they were looking for. Their thousands of footprints churned the ground. Whatever faint trace Dennis had left, whatever a smaller and more careful team might have found, was very likely trampled into the mud by the sheer mass of the people trying to help. When officials reviewed the search afterward, they concluded, among other things, that scent dogs should have been deployed differently, that the rain, while it washed away the old trail, would not have erased a new one if Dennis was still moving. The lessons learned from this search would go on to reshape how the Park Service ran wilderness rescues for decades. But those lessons came too late for Dennis. The search area covered 56 square miles. It ran day after day. More than 13,000 man-hours poured into the mountains. More than $50,000 in equipment and supplies. His father offered a reward of $5,000, a large sum at the time, for any information. The main effort was scaled back on the 29th of June, though a smaller search continued into the summer, and the case was not officially closed until September. And in all of that, across all those searches and all those miles and all those weeks, they found nothing. Not a shoe, not a scrap of red fabric, not a bone, nothing at all. Now picture that. A 6-year-old boy in a bright red shirt, in a place where hundreds of people are actively looking for exactly that color, and the mountains give back nothing. As one person who lived through it later put it, they wanted so badly to find him alive, but no trace was ever found. Nothing. And that seemed almost impossible. So what happened to Dennis Martin? Again, we have to separate what we know from what people have imagined in the vacuum of that silence. The most grounded theory is the one investigators lean toward, and it is heartbreaking in its simplicity. A frightened 6-year-old, disoriented, wandered off in the wrong direction, deeper into the vast drainages that fall away from Spence Field on both the Tennessee and North Carolina sides. The park superintendent and assistant chief ranger shared a personal opinion, written in a letter that September, that if Dennis were ever found, he would be found within a few miles of where he vanished. Lost, alone, in cold and rain. A small child does not survive long in that country. His body may have come to rest in a drainage or a rhododendron thicket so dense and so remote that 1,400 searchers walked right past it. Years later, a ginseng hunter claimed to have found the scattered skeletal remains of a small child in Big Hollow near Tremont, not terribly far from where some footprints thought to be Dennis's had been seen. He said he had kept quiet for years because he had been hunting ginseng illegally and feared prosecution. By the time he came forward in the 1980s, a search of the spot turned up nothing. Then there is the abduction theory, and it centers on a strange account. Around the same afternoon, Dennis vanished. A family named Key was several miles away, over near Cades Cove. A man named Harold Key later reported that he had heard a sharp, brief, high-pitched scream. He went to look and said he saw a rough-looking, unkempt man with long hair moving quickly through the woods toward a white car, and near where the man had been, a piece of paper that looked like a crude map. By the time anyone could follow up, the car was gone. Over the years, this account has fueled a persistent belief that Dennis was taken, but investigators questioned it hard. The distance between Spence Field and Cades Cove is significant, over difficult terrain, and for a 6-year-old to have covered that ground in the time available, on foot, would have been close to impossible. The timing simply does not reconcile. And then there are the wilder theories. the ones that grow like moss over any case that stays unsolved long enough, that a wild animal took him, that a serial killer was at work in the park, that something not of this world reached out of the forest. The author, Michael Bouchard, who fought for years through Freedom of Information requests to get the FBI's 133-page case file released, has looked hard at all of them and dismissed the strangest out of hand. The FBI files, he has said, actually ruled out the serial killer rumor. There is no evidence for any of the paranormal versions, and repeating them mostly serves to pull attention away from the plain, painful likelihood that a little boy got lost and cold and did not make it through the night. Which is to say, after more than 50 years, the most honest thing anyone can tell the Martin family is that we still do not know. Bill Martin, the father who watched his son walk into the trees, carried that unanswered question for the rest of his life. If Dennis were alive today, he would be in his early 60s, a man with grandchildren, probably. Instead, he is a 6-year-old boy in a red shirt, frozen forever at the edge of a mountain meadow, one game of hide and seek away from a whole life he never got to live. He kept up with the grown-ups. He was so proud to finally be old enough to come along, and the mountains he had been taught to love since before he could remember took him in the space of a few minutes on a bright June afternoon, with his father standing only yards away. 7 years later, and only a short drive across those same mountains, another family would send a child into that park for an ordinary day and receive the same unbearable silence in return. Trenny Lynn Gibson was 16 years old, and she was, by every account, an ordinary teenager, which is exactly what makes her story sit so heavy. She lived in Knoxville, Tennessee, the same city Dennis Martin had come from, in a house on Witoa Drive with her mother, Hope, and her father, Robert, whom people called Bob. She had an older brother, Robert Jr., who was 19 and serving in the military, a younger sister named Tina, who was 14, and a little brother, Miracle, who was only 5. She was a sophomore at Bearden High School. She had a part-time job at a cafeteria in the local mall, and she was careful with her money, quietly saving what she earned. The park service records describe her plainly: a good student, no problems, overall in good health, and, in a phrase that would take on a terrible weight, very little outdoor knowledge. Picture a small, unassuming girl. She was about 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighed 115 pounds. On the morning of Friday, the 8th of October, 1976, she got ready and went off with her mother to Bearden High for a school field trip. She was in a horticulture class, taught by a teacher named Wayne Dunlap, and that Friday, Mr. Dunlap was taking around 40 students up into the Great Smoky Mountains for a nature hike. The students did not even know where they were going until they got on the bus. When they learned the destination, Trenny was excited. She sat next to a senior, an older boy named Robert Simpson, who happened to be a friend of her brother. The weather that day was poor, dark and rainy, the kind of grey autumn morning that hints at the cold coming. But the trip was not cancelled. The bus rolled north, up toward the highest point in the park. Their destination was Andrews Bald, one of those high, grassy meadows the Smokies are known for, reached by a trail that starts up near Kuwohi, the peak that for many years was called Klingman's Dome, the tallest mountain in the park. The plan was simple and short. The students would hike out along the Forney Ridge Trail to Andrews Bald, a distance of under 2 miles, take in the scenery, and hike back. A round trip of maybe 3.5 miles, a moderate walk, The kind of thing 40 teenagers do on a field trip and forget about by the next week. Before they set off, Mr. Dunlop gave them clear instructions. Stay on the trail to the bald. Do not go past it. Be back at the bus by 3:30. Trenny left her purse, her coat, and her schoolbooks in the car. She took only her lunch, and she walked out onto the trail with her classmates into the fog and the drizzle of that October afternoon. Now, here is what makes this case so difficult and so different from a child lost in the deep backcountry. Trenny did not wander off alone into trackless wilderness. She was on a short, well-defined trail, surrounded the entire time by dozens of her own classmates. Many students reported seeing her during the hike. This was not a solitary expedition. This was a crowd of teenagers on a busy afternoon on one of the most traveled trails in the park. And yet, the last confirmed sighting places her around 2:50 in the afternoon, roughly half a mile from the parking area where the buses waited on the way back. Classmates later recalled that the group had paused to rest and that Trenny kept walking ahead of them, eager, it seemed, to get back to the bus. She walked on around a bend, and no one who knew her ever saw her again. By 3:30, when the rest of the group reached the buses and got ready to leave, it became clear that Trenny had not come back. The students and adults began searching the immediate area. A park ranger named Lyle was told what was happening and searched around Andrews Bald himself without success, and then made it official: a missing child in the park. Mr. Dunlop sent the bus back to Bearden High with the students, but stayed behind to help look. As evening came on, the weather turned worse. Wind and rain and thick fog rolling across the ridge, and the darkness closed in on the roughly 19 searchers who managed to reach the area that first night. And here is a detail that has troubled people for almost 50 years. Trenny's mother, Hope, was not told her daughter was missing until around 8 o'clock that evening, a full 5 hours after Trenny disappeared. Why the delay? Why did no one reach the family sooner? There is no satisfying answer. In the confusion of that afternoon, the phone calls, the shift back to the school, the scramble to organize a search, 5 hours slipped by before a mother learned her 16-year-old was gone. Let's talk about the search that followed, because it was enormous. The next day, the 9th of October, a full-scale effort began. Half a dozen dog teams, bloodhounds and German shepherds. A ranger named Jack Linehan coordinated it and closed the road between the Klingman's Dome parking area and Newfound Gap. The conditions were miserable and dangerous. Haze and thick foliage cut visibility to almost nothing. Hoarfrost combined with wet fallen leaves made the slope slick and treacherous, and one searcher slipped and fell and broke several ribs. National Guard helicopters were brought in, but could not even lift off until late in the afternoon because of the heavy fog. 2 of Trenny's uncles joined the search with their own dogs. The whole area, from the parking lot out to Andrews Bald and along every side trail, was combed carefully. They found almost nothing. A few ferns broken along the trail near where she was last seen. 3 cigarette butts, a partly finished can of beer. That was all. Whether any of it had anything to do with Trenny, no one could say. There was one thread, and it is a strange one. Someone reported seeing tennis shoe tracks, roughly the size of Trenny's, on the Appalachian Trail, heading in the direction of the Double Spring Gap shelter. That is significant, because it would mean she had somehow gone up and over in the opposite direction from the bus, away from where everyone assumed she would be. but the tracks were lost about half a mile past the junction where the Appalachian Trail meets the route toward Forney Creek and Andrews Bald. They led nowhere, and to this day, no one knows whether they were hers. The first search stretched from the day she vanished until the 18th of October. Then, a limited effort continued into early November. In all, 756 people searched for Trenny Gibson that autumn. And when it was called off for a reason that is its own kind of mystery. No physical evidence could be found to suggest she was even still in the park. The chief ranger told reporters he was almost sure she was not there. Her father refused to give up. The following spring, in April of 1977, Robert Gibson organized a second search of his own. 230 people that ran into May. They combed every trail, drainage, and ridge between Andrews Bald and Elkmont, 15 miles in one direction, and out toward Fontana Lake, 14 miles in the other. They found nothing. The FBI had opened an investigation back in October of 1976, but their case file was never released. Searchers returned to the Clingman's Dome area again in 1981. Again, nothing. So where did Trenny Gibson go? Because this is the heart of it. A girl on a short trail, surrounded by 40 classmates, half a mile from a parking lot full of buses, in broad daylight. That is not a place where people simply evaporate, and yet she did. There is a theory that she got lost. It is the natural first thought, and it cannot be entirely dismissed, because the park had already proven with Dennis Martin that it could hide a lost person completely. Maybe Trenny, described as having very little outdoor knowledge, stepped off the trail for a moment, got turned around in the fog, and walked the wrong way into the drainages, just as investigators believe Dennis had. In that terrain, in that weather, a lost and inexperienced hiker could be in serious trouble within an hour. But there is a problem with the lost theory. She vanished on a short, obvious trail close to the parking lot, on the return leg, with people not far ahead and behind her. It is very hard to get truly lost in that situation, and the massive, careful search that followed found no sign at all that she had gone into the woods and died there, which pushes many people toward the second theory, that Trenny did not get lost, that she was taken. The chief ranger's own comment, that he was almost certain she was not in the park, points that way. If she was not in the park, then someone removed her from it. The Clingman's Dome Road was open to traffic. The parking lot was full of cars and visitors. A person could, in theory, have been walking out ahead of her classmates, reached the parking area or the road, and been met or intercepted by someone in a vehicle and driven away before anyone even knew she was missing. Some have wondered about those tennis shoe tracks leading the wrong way toward the Appalachian Trail. Some have wondered about that 5-hour delay before anyone realized what had happened, a delay that would have given an abductor an enormous head start. But here, we have to be honest and careful, the way we always try to be. There is no suspect. There has never been a suspect named publicly in this case. There is no evidence pointing at any particular person. The abduction theory is built on the absence of any other explanation, on the fact that a girl vanished from a place where getting lost seems nearly impossible. Absence of evidence is a hard thing to build a certainty on, and it would be wrong and unfair to point a finger at anyone when the facts simply do not support it. Over the years, there were the usual false hopes and dead ends. In the early days of the search, a hospital in Haywood County, North Carolina, thought they might have treated Trenny on the day she vanished. A photograph was taken over for identification. It turned out to be someone else. Investigators kept reviewing unidentified remains cases that might match her description. None ever did. Her case is now one of only a handful of missing persons cases from the Great Smoky Mountains that the National Park Service still officially lists. If Trenny Gibson were alive today, she would be in her 60s. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has produced age-progressed images of what she might look like now, a woman with grandchildren, a whole life lived. But no confirmed sighting of her has ever surfaced, not one in almost 50 years, which is to say, the fundamental fact of her case has never changed. A 16-year-old girl, a good student who was careful with her money and excited about a field trip, walked ahead of her friends on a short, easy trail on a rainy afternoon and disappeared before she could reach the bus that was waiting half a mile away. Her mother learned of it 5 hours too late, and the answer her family has waited nearly half a century for has never come. 2 children now, from the same city, lost in the same mountains 7 years apart. And still, the country was not done. 5 years later, and 2,000 miles to the west, in the high granite of Yosemite, another 14-year-old girl would walk toward a lake to take a photograph and vanish just as completely in plain sight in the middle of the afternoon. Let's talk about Stacey Arras and about how a person can vanish in a place where you can see for hundreds of yards in every direction. Stacey Ann Arras was 14 years old, from the San Francisco Bay Area of California. In July of 1981, she went on a trip with her father George into Yosemite National Park. It was meant to be a special few days together, a 4-day excursion on horseback up into the high country along the loop that connects a string of remote backcountry lodges called the High Sierra Camps. For a 14-year-old, it was an adventure. For a father, it was time with his daughter in one of the most beautiful places on earth. She was described as 5 feet, 5 inches tall, around 120 pounds, with blonde hair. On the day she disappeared, she was wearing a white windbreaker, a light short-sleeve blouse with lace trim, striped shorts, and importantly, hiking boots. Remember the boots. They matter later. On the 17th of July, Stacey and George set out from Tuolumne Meadows with a group. The exact number has been reported differently over the years, but it seems to have been around 10 people, including the guides, a small party riding mules and horses up into the mountains. They followed the John Muir Trail, stopped for lunch near the Cathedral Lakes, and rode on through the afternoon towards Sunrise High Sierra Camp. It is a remote and lovely place, 9,400 feet above sea level, a cluster of tent cabins set against an alpine meadow with the high peaks all around. It can house a few dozen guests. It sits well off any road, miles into the backcountry, at the far end of a 50-mile loop. The group reached the camp around 3 in the afternoon and settled in for the night. Stacey and her father were to share a cabin. After the long, dusty ride, she took a shower and changed her clothes. And then, in that golden, late afternoon light, she decided she wanted to take some photographs. She had her camera. She told her father she wanted to walk a little way down the trail toward the lakes to take pictures. Now picture George Martin's daughter about to head out, and picture the small, careful thing her father did, because it tells you something. Stacy had put on sandals, or by some accounts flip-flops. George told her to change into proper footwear, so she went back and put on her hiking boots. This was not a careless family. This was a father paying attention to his 14-year-old, making sure she was properly shod before she took a short walk in the mountains. And she was not going alone. She set off in the company of an older member of the group, a 77-year-old man named Gerald Stewart. The families evidently knew each other well enough that George was comfortable letting his daughter walk with him. The plan was a short hike, maybe 1.5 miles of trail toward the Sunrise Lakes. Stacy and Gerald walked only a short distance from camp, a few 100 yards, not miles. And then Gerald grew tired. He was 77 at 9,000 feet after a long day of riding. He told Stacy he needed to rest, and he sat down on a boulder just above the lakes. Stacy told him she was going to continue on down toward the lake to take her pictures and that she would be back in a few minutes. One of the camp's trail guides, working nearby at the corral, glanced over and saw Stacy standing on a rock about 50 yards south of the trail, camera in hand. That guide and old Gerald resting on his boulder were the last two people to ever see Stacy Arras. She walked down a granite slope toward a scattered line of trees near the lake, and she was gone. Have you ever tried to imagine the actual mechanics of that? Not the mystery of it, but the plain physical fact. It is late afternoon in July, hours of daylight left. The terrain is open, high country granite, the kind of place where the sightlines run for hundreds of yards. There are two people within earshot, one of them watching her walk away. She is wearing sturdy boots. She is a few minutes from camp, and in the space of that short walk toward the tree line, a healthy 14-year-old girl simply stops existing. No scream, no sound. When she did not come back, when Gerald finally roused himself and returned to camp alone and the alarm went up, searchers retraced her steps almost immediately, and they found exactly one thing: the lens from her camera lying on the trail, nothing else. There was no clothing and no footprints leading anywhere strange, no drag marks, no sign of a fall, no blood on the rocks, no torn fabric on the brush, just a camera lens lying where a girl had been a short time before, and then the granite and the trees and the enormous indifferent silence of the High Sierra. The National Park Service launched a search almost at once, and it was a serious one. Over the following days, by some accounts, up to 150 people were involved, including 67 volunteers from the Mountain Rescue Association, some of the most experienced wilderness searchers in the region. Dogs, 3 helicopters, one of them in the air for more than 40 hours, flying grid patterns. They concentrated on an area of 3 to 5 square miles around the Sunrise Lakes, scouring every ridge and drainage and boulder field. The ground search ran for over a week, into the 26th of July, before it was finally called off. They found nothing more, not one additional trace of Stacy Arras, just that single camera lens, and then nothing, ever again. So let's walk carefully through what might have happened, because this case, more than almost any other, resists explanation. The first and most rational theory is that she fell. The high country around Sunrise is not as gentle as it looks. Beyond the open granite, there are crevices, cracks in the rock, steep drops, places a person could slip into and be hidden completely from anyone passing a few feet away. If Stacy left the trail to get a better angle for a photograph, if she climbed onto a rock or worked her way toward the water and lost her footing, she could have fallen into a crevice or a gap in the boulders that concealed her entirely. It is worth being honest, too, that some people who know Yosemite well have questioned the official account itself, pointing out that there is no lake directly in sight of the camp, that the geography in the news reports does not quite line up, and that Stacy may have hiked considerably farther into considerably more dangerous ground than the simple story suggests. If she went farther than anyone realized, there was far more country in which to fall and far more places to disappear. The second theory is a bear or animal attack. Yosemite has more black bears than almost anywhere else in the lower United States, but this theory does not hold up well. Fatal bear attacks in Yosemite are extraordinarily rare, and a bear attack leaves signs, a great deal of them. There were no signs, nothing that suggested a struggle or a kill, just the quiet and the camera lens. The third theory is abduction, and it is the one that the strange, clean nature of the case keeps pushing people toward. But look at the geography. Sunrise High Sierra Camp is miles from the nearest road. The only road through that part of the park, Tioga Road, is over 4 miles away across rough country. For someone to have abducted Stacy and gotten her out of the park, they would have had to move a struggling or unconscious teenager for miles over open ground, past a camp full of people, without leaving a single track or being seen by anyone. It is not impossible. Some have quietly wondered about members of the group itself, since the last people near her were part of her own party, and since the full case file, said to run to around 2,000 pages, has never been publicly released despite the passage of more than 40 years. But there is no evidence pointing to any individual. To name a suspect here would be pure speculation, and it would be unfair to people who may simply have had the misfortune to be nearby on the worst day of a family's life. And then there is the theory that she ran away. In the days after she vanished, a newspaper reported that park officials had said Stacy was dealing with some family or school troubles and missed her teenage boyfriend, floating the idea that she might have simply walked off on her own. But her mother firmly denied that she had any serious boyfriend, and a Park Service spokeswoman contradicted the runaway idea directly. And think about it practically. If a 14-year-old wanted to run away, she does not do it by walking into trackless 9,000-foot wilderness, miles from any road, in the late afternoon, with no supplies, having just carefully changed into her hiking boots at her father's request. It does not fit. It reads instead like the kind of thing that gets said in the confused early days of a case, when people reach for the explanation that lets them believe a child is alive somewhere by choice. Which is to say, when you strip away the theories that do not fit, you are left standing more or less where the searchers stood in July of 1981, on a slope of granite in the fading light, holding a single camera lens, looking at a line of trees, unable to understand how a girl walked into them and never came out. Stacy Arras has now been missing for more than 40 years. Her case, like Trenny Gibson's, remains open, one of the enduring disappearances of the national parks. If she were alive today, she would be in her late 50s. George Arras, the father who told his daughter to put on her proper boots and then watched her walk off to take her pictures, lived the rest of his life with that image. Her father's small, loving act of caution, and then the tree line, and then nothing. She wanted a good photograph of a beautiful lake in the mountains. She was gone in the time it takes to walk a few hundred yards. And all these years later, the only thing the mountain ever gave back was the lens she meant to see it through. 4 people now, a desert, and 2 children lost in the eastern mountains, and a girl swallowed by the western granite. 4 searches, 4 silences. But the last of our 5 stories is different, because in the case of a 66-year-old grandmother lost off the Appalachian Trail in Maine, the wilderness did eventually give her back, and what it gave back may be the hardest part of this whole long night to sit with, because we know, almost to the day, exactly how her story ended. Geraldine Largay was 66 years old, and everyone who loved her called her Jerry. She was a retired nurse and an Air Force veteran from Brentwood, Tennessee. She was a wife and a mother and a grandmother, married to a man named George, with a daughter named Kerry. And in the spring of 2013, she set out to do something she had dreamed about, to hike the Appalachian Trail, that famous ribbon of footpath that runs more than 2,000 miles up the spine of the eastern United States, from Georgia all the way to Mount Katahdin in Maine. She did not attempt the whole thing at once. She started in April at Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, planning to hike north more than 1,100 miles to the trail's end in Maine. And she was not doing it entirely alone. She had a hiking partner, a friend named Jane Lee, and the 2 of them would walk the trail together while George, Jerry's husband, drove to meet them at road crossings along the way, resupplying them, seeing his wife every few days. It was a good plan, a loving arrangement. George would later say, with gentle humor, that hiking the trail was not on his bucket list, but that his wife needed the support. And so he told himself to suck it up, and he did it. Jerry had a trail name, the way through hikers do, because she walked slowly and steadily. Other hikers called her Inchworm. There's something tender about that name, when you know how her story ends. Inchworm, slow and patient, and determined to keep going. But you should also know the harder truths about Jerry, because they are part of what happened, and telling her story honestly means telling all of it. Her hiking partner Jane later said that Jerry had a poor sense of direction, that she had taken wrong turns on the trail more than once, that Jane had sometimes had to double back and find her walking the wrong way. Jerry was, by some accounts, afraid of the dark and prone to anxiety. Her doctor said she took medication for panic attacks. None of this makes her less brave. If anything, it makes her braver. A woman in her mid-60s who struggled with direction and with fear, choosing to walk 1,000 miles of wilderness anyway. But it also meant that she was, in a way, her family has understandably pushed back against a little bit in over her head out there alone. And alone is what she became. At the end of June, while the 2 women were in New Hampshire, Jane had to leave the trail suddenly for a family emergency. Jerry insisted on going on by herself. She had come so far. Katahdin was less than 200 miles ahead. She kept walking. By the 21st of July, she had reached western Maine and a shelter called the Poplar Ridge Lean-To. On the morning of the 22nd, she left it, planning to hike about 8 miles north to the next shelter, and then, the following day, to continue on to a road crossing at State Route 27, where George would be waiting to meet her. Now picture that morning. It is an ordinary morning on the trail. She has walked more than 900 miles to get here. She is tired, but she's close. And at some point that morning, She stepped off the trail into the trees for the most ordinary and human of reasons: to go to the bathroom, to have a moment of privacy in the woods. And when she turned to come back, she could not find the trail. That is all it took. In the dense Maine forest, thick and green and disorienting, where one stand of trees looks much like the next, Jerry Largay stepped a short distance off the path and lost it. And for a woman with a poor sense of direction, alone, that single wrong turn became a trap she could not escape. She did the thing that people in trouble do now. She reached for her phone. At about 11 in the morning, she typed a text message to George. It read, in the shorthand of a frightened person, that she was in some trouble, that she had gotten off the trail to go to the bathroom and was now lost. And could he please call the Appalachian Mountain Club to see if a trail maintainer could help her? She was, she thought, somewhere north of a woods road. The message never went through. There was no cell service where she stood. She did not know that, of course, so she walked, trying to find higher ground, hoping for a signal, and in doing so, she walked farther from the trail. Over the next 90 minutes or so, she tried to send that message 10 more times. None of them were delivered. The next day, she tried again. Lost since yesterday, she wrote. Off the trail 3 or 4 miles. Call the police for what to do, please. That one failed too. Her husband, waiting at the road crossing, never received a single one of her messages because of the poor or non-existent cell coverage in that stretch of the Maine woods. Here is one of the small, cruel facts of this case. Jerry thought she was 3 or 4 miles from the trail. She was not. She was about 3,000 feet from it, a little over half a mile. Close enough that on a good day, a person could walk it in half an hour, if only they knew which direction to go. But she did not know, and the forest was so thick that half a mile might as well have been 100. By the afternoon of the 24th of July, George realized his wife was overdue. He flagged down a passing police officer, and one of the largest searches in Maine's history began. The Maine Warden Service led it. They brought in dogs that could follow the scent of a lost person, aircraft, the FBI. Hundreds of people searched. They quickly determined that Jerry was not on the trail itself. And then they simply could not find her. There were almost no clues. Her phone had pinged a tower the afternoon she got lost, and that was nearly all they had. The forest was dense, and it held its secret. The initial intensive search was suspended after about a week, and though the wardens never truly stopped, though they chased leads for 2 more years, some of them absurd, tips from psychics, one even suggesting that Bigfoot was responsible, Jerry Largay was not found. But here is what none of them knew, and what would only be understood much later. Jerry did not die that first day, or that first week. When she realized she was lost, she made a camp. She set up her tent about 2 miles from the trail by the route she had wandered. She had some food and water and her camping supplies, and she had a journal. And in that journal, day after day, she wrote. She was following, in her own way, the standard advice given to lost hikers, to stay in one place and wait to be rescued, rather than wander deeper into danger. It was, at first, exactly the right choice. She stayed put. She rationed what she had. She wrote to her family, personal letters really, a record of her thoughts and her days. Investigators would later be able to reconstruct a timeline of her activities from the 22nd of July onward. From those entries, she survived, alone in that tent, for close to a month. there is evidence that she fought to be found. At her campsite, searchers would later find signs that she had tried to set nearby trees on fire, to send up smoke, to signal the aircraft she could surely hear passing overhead. The site was in dense woods, hard to see until you were almost on top of it, though there was a break in the forest canopy not far away, where a camp would have been easier to spot from the air. She was so close to being visible, so close to the trail, so close, and the forest hid her anyway. And then there's the entry that has broken the heart of everyone who has read it. It is dated the 6th of August, more than 2 weeks after she got lost. By then, it seems, she understood. She wrote a message asking that whoever found her body please call her husband George and her daughter Kerry. She wrote that it would be the greatest kindness for them to know that she was dead and where she was found, no matter how many years from now. She asked that whoever found her please find it in their heart to mail the contents of her bag to one of them. She had accepted what was coming, and even then, alone in the woods, her thoughts were of sparing her family the not knowing, of the kindness of an answer. There were journal entries after that. The last dated one is from around the 18th of August, 26 or 27 days after she stepped off the trail, though the wardens were unsure whether she had kept perfect track of the days by then. And then the writing stops. For more than 2 years, George and Kerry Largay lived in exactly the silence that Jerry had prayed they would be spared. They did not know if she was alive or dead. They did not know where she was. They endured the false leads, the theories, the terrible open-ended waiting that every family in this long night has known. And then, on a day in October of 2015, more than 2 years after she vanished, a forester named Kevin Adam was surveying a piece of United States Navy property in Reddington Township, land the Navy used for wilderness survival training. In the dense woods, he came across an old campsite, and there he found what he feared might be human remains. He would later describe the moment, turning over the possibilities in his mind, whether it was a body at all, and if it was, whether it could be the woman who had been missing for so long. As he reached the site, he became all but certain. It was Jerry Largay's camp. She was there, inside her tent, in her sleeping bag, along with her journal and her belongings and her final words. The site was about 3,000 feet from the Appalachian Trail she had walked all the way from West Virginia to reach. DNA confirmed it. After 2 years, 2 months, and more than 3 weeks, Jerry Largay had been found. The medical examiner and investigators concluded there was no foul play. Jerry had simply made a wrong turn, off the trail, and never found her way back. Her family, receiving at last the answer she had begged the woods to give them, released a statement confirming that no one had harmed her. She had been let down by nothing more than a moment of bad luck, a thick forest, and the absence of a phone signal that might have brought George to her in an afternoon. Have you ever thought about how thin the line is, how narrow the margin between an ordinary day on a trail and a tragedy that swallows years? Jerry Largay did everything a lost hiker is told to do. She stopped and she stayed. She waited and she signaled, and she survived with remarkable strength for the better part of a month. And she was half a mile from the path the entire time, in a country where hundreds of people were searching for her, and it was not enough. The experts who later reviewed the case gently noted that after so many days without rescue, she might have done better to try to walk out. to follow a stream downhill toward a road. But that is the clarity of hindsight. In the moment, alone and afraid and doing exactly what she had been taught, she waited for a rescue that came 2 years too late. Which is to say, of our 5, Jerry Lage is the one the wilderness returned, and her return did not bring the relief you might expect. It brought a different and heavier kind of knowledge. Because now we know. We know she survived for weeks. We know she tried again and again to reach the people who loved her. We know how close she was, and we know that in the end she thought not of herself, but of the mercy of letting her family finally know. The others are still out there. Everett in his drowned canyon, Dennis in his green mountains, Trenny and Stacy somewhere under the same sky. We do not have their journals. We do not have their final words. We have only the silence. And Jerry Lage, found at last in her tent, is the one who reminds us what that silence has been hiding for all of them all along. A person, frightened and brave and hoping right to the end to be found. Let's sit for a moment with all 5 of them together before we let the night close. They are separated by nearly 80 years and by a whole continent. Everett Roos in the Red Canyons of Utah in 1934. Dennis Martin in the Smoky Mountains in 1969. Trenny Gibson in those same mountains in 1976. Stacy Arras in the high granite of Yosemite in 1981. Jerry Lage in the Maine woods in 2013. Different decades, different landscapes, different lives. And yet the shape of what happened to each of them is almost the same, and almost unbearably simple. Each of them stepped, for just a moment, out of the ordinary world. A young artist rode a little deeper into a canyon. A small boy took a few steps into the trees to surprise his father. A teenage girl walked ahead of her friends toward a waiting bus. Another walked down a slope toward a lake to take a photograph. A grandmother stepped off the path for a moment of privacy. None of them did anything reckless. None of them did anything you and I have not done 100 times on a walk in the woods. And the wilderness closed over each of them so completely that 4 have never been found at all. And the 5th was found only after 2 years, in a tent, half a mile from where she got lost. Have you ever wondered why these stories hold us the way they do? It is not the gore, because most of them involve no violence at all, only absence. I think it is because they touch something we would rather not look at directly. The knowledge that the world is very large and very old and largely indifferent to us. That the same mountains and deserts we drive to on the weekend for their beauty are not, in any sense, safe. That the margin between a good day and a catastrophe can be a single wrong turn, a moment of fog a few 100 yards. These people were not fools. They were loved and ordinary and careful in the ways most of us are careful. And it was not enough. But if there is a lesson in these 5 stories, I do not think it is fear. I think it is closer to the opposite. Because behind every one of these cases was a real person, not a mystery, not a case number, not a spooky story to tell in the dark. Everett Roos was a boy who wrote poetry and traded prints with famous artists and loved the desert so much he could barely stand to leave it. Dennis Martin was a 6-year-old so proud to finally be old enough to join the men on their Father's Day hike. Trenny Gibson was a careful, hard-working 16-year-old who saved the money she earned at the mall and was excited about a school field trip. Stacy Arras was a 14-year-old with a camera chasing good light on a mountain lake. And Jerry Lage was a grandmother and a nurse and a veteran who was slow and steady and brave enough to walk 1,000 miles, and whose last thoughts were of sparing the people she loved from grief. They were not defined by how they vanished. They were defined, every one of them, by how they lived, by the people who loved them and searched for them and never stopped. Stella Roos, who went down into that canyon herself and kept the search for her son alive for 30 years until the day she died. Bill Martin, who watched his boy walk into the trees and carried that image for the rest of his life. Robert Gibson, who organized his own search for his daughter when the official one ended and combed 30 miles of ridgeline looking for her. George Arras, who told his daughter to put on her boots. George Largay, who did not want to hike the trail at all and hiked it anyway because his wife needed him to. So tonight, as you think about their stories, maybe do not remember these 5 for the mystery of their last afternoons. Remember them for who they were before, and maybe let their stories be a small, quiet reminder to tell the people you love that you love them before they walk out the door, to pay attention to each other the way George Arras paid attention to a pair of shoes, to not take for granted the ordinary miracle of watching someone you care about walk away and then come safely back. 4 of these 5 are still out there, somewhere, held by the country that took them. Their families are, many of them, still waiting, still hoping that someday a hiker will find something, that some canyon or drainage or stretch of forest will finally give up what it has kept for so long and let them bring their person home. Until then, we can at least do this. We can remember their names: Everett Roos, Dennis Martin, Trenny Gibson, Stacey Arras, Geraldine Largay. They walked into the wilderness on ordinary days for ordinary reasons. They did not come back, but they are not forgotten. And as long as someone, somewhere, still says their names into the quiet, their stories are not finished. Rest well, wherever you are.